I'm Rabyd, otherwise known as the Rabyd Atheist, a former pastor turned atheist, now compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. Feel free to like or dislike the video as you see fit, so feel free to hit those buttons. Feel free to comment below, and I would appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel and hit your notification bell for more content as it is released. You're also free to share my videos as much as you like. The purpose of this channel is educational in regards to deconversion and atheist issues and politics, philosophy, Bible theology, and anything else I can come up with in relationship to those issues. I'd also like to extend a warm welcome to those of you of the Rabyd Nation and those of you that want to be. Today I want to look at a subject that's a little bit more of a deconversion subject in the issue of those of us that have come out of, say, a purity culture of Christianity when it comes to sexually related issues. This kind of goes along with the theme here in the United States. It's Pride Month for those that are LGBTQ. I've already done a video on that earlier this week about how I do make my stand with that community, even though I'm not really sure I belong to that community myself, other than in one particular way. You can check out that video and get a full story there. But when I was growing up, and this is what caused me to think of this, because I was watching a few other people react to Paula Morgan and some of their videos, and I began to realize that this purity culture thing is still very much alive and well in the Christian church. And in my humble opinion, it is probably far more damaging to people's relationships, particularly between men and women, than probably most other things that you deal with in the church world. Now, when I was growing up, of course, there was very little talk about sexual issues before I was 10, 11 years old. And then all of a sudden, it seemed like every parent that had teenagers and down to my age seemed to be interested in sexual issues because they wanted to know what to say to us and what to talk about and all the hush-hush tones of, sexual intercourse and everything else. And the real sad part of the whole thing is that a good chunk of us had already figured a lot of things out. I think one of the strange things, at least in my world, was that I kind of hit puberty a little bit early. And so while my friends were out playing with the frogs by the river and, trying to drown each other in the swimming hole or whatever, I was already noticing that girls were different and that I kind of liked those differences. So by the time my parents and everybody got around to trying to teach me about this stuff, I was already well on my way to trying to educate myself into what was going on. And purity culture kind of reared its ugly head at that point, because purity culture has always been around in certain elements of the church. And what that is this idea of saving yourself for sexual activity until marriage, and that, particularly for women, I think it's even worse than for boys, but for women, it's like, oh, if you're not a virgin on your wedding night, then you've soiled yourself, you're damaged goods. There's all kinds of analogies, that people use to kind of put a guilt trip on young ladies that, you're a lesser person when you get married and you've already had sex. So it was kind of one of those things that really bothered me even back then, because it always seemed to be, and this is pretty true of a lot of religion, is they were always trying to channel our viewpoint down a certain avenue without really answering the questions that we were asking. In my particular case, I was simply trying to figure out what exactly was going on with me, because my desires from the year before to the time that I was hitting puberty had completely changed. I was very much more interested in girls than most of the boys my age, but I couldn't really let that out. I couldn't really talk about it. And it created a real barrier. But as we grew up and went through our teenage years, the message was always reinforced. Don't do it until you're married. Don't do it until you're married. Don't do it until you're married. And a lot of us attempted, I think, to go down that route despite the fact that when you start really getting into your teenage years, your sex drive is off the chart. And yet you've got God telling you that you're committing this terrible sin that'll keep you out of heaven and everything else if you do these things. And purity culture kind of reinforces the guilt trip. And this is what I don't like about the purity culture is it makes you feel guilty over stuff that's normal. I kind of have mentioned in several videos that Jesus' admonition that, if you even look with lust at somebody, you've committed adultery or fornication in your heart with them. The attempt at mind control there is really, really devastating, I think, to young people, because you can't have a healthy discussion about how that's normal, that you're biologically conditioned, for procreation. At least most of us are. There are, of course, asexual people, and there's people that are drawn to their own sex, and whether that's procreative, I guess that's a question. But we have a lot of modern things that allows even same-sex couples to have children, so it's not as difficult to kind of realize that anymore. But back in the day, when I was going through all this in the mid 80s, I really felt the pressure from the church establishment and the church leaders. One of the things that we found is, every time we'd turn around, the pastor would kind of be in our face about things. But we found ways to get around it. And the problem with the purity culture is because they assume that abstinence is the way to go, they don't really inform you of a lot of other things. And almost everything I learned that was actually real about sexual activity, I learned outside of the church. Because the church, with their purity culture, just assumes that we're all going to be good boys and girls. And that just is a really lousy, bad assumption. The real problem is, once you get cuddled up with somebody and you start going at it, a few other things take over other than your rational thoughts. And this is completely normal. But it also put everybody in a very vulnerable position. And as I look back at my church experience when it comes to the issues of sex and sexuality, there was a very narrow focus on what we were supposed to do. Resist the temptation, don't give in to it. Don't have sex until you're married. I'm going to tell you, looking back at this, I think this is probably one of the stupidest things I've ever heard. If you do nothing but abstinence only education, you're going to end up with a couple of things. One, you're going to have couples that are indeed going to have sex, and then they're going to feel guilty as hell about something that is perfectly normal. And then the second thing you're going to have is unwanted pregnancy, because the fact of the matter is, if you don't talk about other forms of birth control, even back then we had several, and nobody was allowed to talk about that. You don't want to do that until you're married. Or in some cases, I heard kids were told that, birth control is evil, so therefore they shouldn't do any of it at all. And I was like, okay, I guess you're going to have a lot of kids. But over the years, I ended up learning things from sources that were even also condemned by the church. I mean, pornographic magazines became my outlet to trying to figure all this stuff out. And so, as I was probably one of those guys that actually did read the Playboy articles. And slowly but surely, you kind of build up some sort of real understanding of how the world outside the church views sexuality. And at that time, the mores were kind of coming off, although the AIDS epidemic had just started. And so it was kind of one of those things where, see, God is punishing people for stepping out of his boundaries. And it's always amazing to me how the church will take any situation like that and try to control us more. Now I look at it as a very cultic behavior. It's interesting that most cults try to control two things in your life. Number one, well, actually three. Number one, they try to control who you have relationships with and what kind of relationship you have with your family. The other thing they try to control is your money. It's no accident most cult leaders say, give me all your money and I'll take care of you. And then the third thing is sexuality. There's always some sort of control mechanism on sexual relations, and those things are used to control and manipulate people. And I don't think it's any different in the regular mainstream church. I think the abstinence only crowd and the purity culture are going to be virgins on our wedding night culture really diminishes a lot of opportunity to really get to know somebody. I've watched people talk about, oh my God, the one video I saw, this week where the couple, I think it's Paul and Morgan, were advocating you don't need lots of years to figure out whether or not you want to marry this person. You're going to get married in 4 months, 4 to 6 months. And I'm like, oh, hell no. The real problem with that, of course, as anybody will tell you that's actually studied the subject, is whenever you're in a new relationship, you have this 2-year honeymoon phase. But I remember the church specifically back then teaching us that very thing, that 4 to 6 months was plenty of time, because after that, you're just going to burn with lust towards each other, and you're going to end up having sex, and then you're going to be guilty before God and all this other bullshit. And I now kind of realize that that was a very bad advice, and it's no accident that I keep coming back to this subject, because a lot of things that ended up long-term affecting my sexual relationships with my wife and other things ended up going back to the church's teaching back then when we were teenagers, because you begin to look at sex in and of itself as a little bit icky, and there's actually nothing icky about it, other than the physical aspects of it. But there's nothing morally wrong with having sex with somebody. None that I can find. There's no rational reason to say that, these things can't be done. I mean, there's some talk about incest being damaging from a genetic point of view if you have offspring. If you really look at sex rationally, there's a lot of things today that we can do to prevent sexually transmitted diseases. And my only issues now with sex is it consensual and is it safe? And that seems to be the consensus with a lot of us that are a little bit more godless, heathenish, such as ourselves. And as I look at this subject now, I can look back at it and see how damaging this was, because there's a lot of guilt associated with sexually related issues in the church. The idea of sex before marriage, of sex outside of marriage, of the pornography issues and everything else. I lost track when I was in the ministry in particular of how many ministers I ended up hearing going on 1 or 2 year probationary stints because they were looking at porn. That was it. That was their high crime. Looking back at this, I'm like, I don't really think that if there was an omnipotent God, he'd give 2 shits about the sex life of some creatures on a ball spinning in a galaxy that is on the edge of the universe that nobody gives a shit about. I don't think God would really care about that. And so, looking back at it now, there was a lot of guilt associated with that. And part of the deconversion process is in relationship to purity culture, because I know I've had a couple of conversations with people that have come out of that real hyper, don't think sexual thoughts, they're bad things, and they really feel damaged in that part of their relationship with their partner or partners or whatever. And they have to kind of get over that. You always have that feeling, oh, somebody's watching us and is going to get us. And it's really kind of sick how the church gives you this idea that when you're about to make love to somebody, that he's watching you. You create this notion of God as the ultimate peeping Tom that looks in on everybody's sexual activity. And it really causes people to like, oh my God, and it's like, instead of having this wonderful, relaxing, well, sometimes not relaxing experience, you're too worried about what God thinks. And it's really been a liberating thing for me to realize that there is no God looking over my shoulder when I'm in the bedroom. And I think it's something that you have to get used to. The idea of this all-present God that's always watching you seems to be more present when you're about to be intimate with somebody or you're about to, engage in certain activities of a sexual nature. And so I don't know. I look at it now from a deconversion standpoint. This is something that a lot of people have to get over. And, I'm no expert on this, and today I'm just really kind of having a discussion about this to get some input on what you think about this idea of purity culture. And, since deconverting, have you had to relook at your sexuality or your sexual life differently? And how has it changed it? Do you still have some lingering after effects of all that still seem to hang around and just kind of cause more problems than they're worth? Are you like me that every once in a while I just feel like somebody's watching over my shoulder, and that's not really the case of what's happening at all? So that's the subject of discussion today. I'm always interested to hear your feedback. But the whole purity culture, the whole God of watching our sex lives is kind of out of my life, but I always feel like something's still there from a psychological point of view. So I'm kind of interested in hearing your comments. I want to thank everybody for stopping by today. Just a reminder to continue to like, to share, subscribe. I appreciate every ounce of effort that you guys do in that. Everything you do gets the channel noticed, and I appreciate that. You're also free to follow me on Facebook. That's a good way to get announcements about the channel. I'm much more comfortable with that platform when it comes to those kind of things. And then, of course, I have my links to Patreon and PayPal. Another little thing that maybe I'll put to you, the viewers, and you can comment on this. I only have one tier right now on Patreon. And it's called the Rabyd Nation. And so far, only one Patreon supporter, but I will get that out a little bit more as I get some things organized for that. But I'm thinking of two other tiers that would be a little bit higher than the $3 that they suggest. So, because I've already had at least one request of that regard that they wanted to give more, but the $3 was all that they could give. And what I want to know is, I guess, what is an acceptable amount, but also I'm looking for some creative names for those tiers, and I'm willing to take suggestions from the audience. So thank you for that. But once again, all those links are in the description, and hopefully I can convince you to be a rabid atheist like myself. In the meantime, this is Ed Rabyd, also known as the Rabid Atheist, signing off and wishing you a good day.